I'm Rebecca Ginsburg, the author of At Home with Apartheid, a book about relations between domestic workers and their white employers in apartheid-era South Africa. Master Harold and the Boys is set in 1950 Port Elizabeth, South Africa, 2 years after the success of the National Party in the elections in South Africa and a year after the introduction of apartheid legislation. To a remarkable extent, whites were able to dissociate what happened in their own homes from those obvious and crude manifestations of apartheid. And they did so primarily by understanding the employment of domestic servants to be part of a tradition to which they considered themselves heir, of employing menials in the home to take care of the maintenance of that home. But they were often able to rationalize the imposition of rules such as Africans should eat on a separate set of dishes than the white family eats. Africans should not sit on any furniture within the house. Only whites can sit on furniture. Africans, if they're going to sit in the house, even Africans who have worked in my family for 20 or 30 years, should sit on the floor if they're going to sit at all. Servants' quarters in white establishments followed a remarkably similar pattern throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century and across the eastern part of South Africa. If we could go back and look at the boarding house or the private white home, we wouldn't see anything that struck us as different from homes in the United States at the same time. Where we would be surprised is when we walked out the back door and saw in the yard a shelter about 8 feet by 10 feet that we wouldn't be able to categorize. It's not exactly a tool shed. It's too big for a tool shed, perhaps. It's not a guest house because it's way too small to be a guest house. And that was, in fact, the domestic workers' room. Almost all properties built in the eastern part of South Africa during this time had such structures on the property, built as a matter of course. The domestic workers' quarters were self-contained units, often painted in the same color as the main house because they were meant to be almost decorative features in the backyard. So it was very common that they were painted in the same color as the main house, that they might have a very attractive garden. It's when you would enter such a structure that you would be able to clearly see this was meant for a person of inferior status. What would these signs be? One, the lack of a ceiling. Domestic workers' quarters had roofs, of course, and no ceiling separating the room from the corrugated iron roof. They generally had cement floors. Walls were often unpainted. Many had one plug, and some had no plugs at all, and people used lanterns to light. There was no heat in these rooms. Generally, there's enough space in these rooms for a bed, a thin mattress, metal frame, perhaps a chest as well, or a wardrobe in the corner. And basically that was it. And it was in these rooms that domestic workers, male and female, spent much of their time when they weren't employed. They were uncomfortable spaces. I heard this over and over again in the interviews I conducted with domestic workers. I heard stories and I experienced for myself. Wind coming through the windows and underneath the doors. They were cold in winter. They were hot in summer. They were dark just about all of the time. And many workers understood them to be pretty vibrant expressions of contempt. As some people told me, they provide better living conditions for their dogs than they do for us. During the period of negotiations, after which Nelson Mandela became president and apartheid legislation was slowly but definitely disbanded, situations in white homes got worse. Whites began to realize that the political, social, economic power that they had held in South Africa was escaping them. Much of the fears, I would venture to say, and frustrations and desperation associated with that realization were vented upon the Africans closest at hand, which is to say the Africans employed in their household. That seems to have shifted. We have no longer seen that rise in violence towards domestic workers in white homes, and increasing numbers of workers living in conditions such that even if things get really bad in the White House, at night they can close the door and go home to their families or to their friends and get some support and affection and love.